So let me welcome everybody back to the Policies for Better Lives conference. My name is Chris Barrington-Leigh. I'm the academic convener for this conference and the faculty member at the Institute for Health and Social Policy. And I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands where we're on today. In Canada, from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation are the traditional custodians and of the lands and waters from which those of us who are in Montreal today are joining. And I'd like to recognize that any effort to conceive of new and better policy must also acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and that reconciliation and collaboration are up to each of us as well as all of us. So welcome to the second week of our 4-week conference. Hopefully many of you were just in one of the sessions that happened in the previous 2 hours. Prior to that, last week we had our opening panel, and hopefully through attending or watching the recording, you all feel a bit familiar with the evidence base behind the modern science of subjective well-being. By asking people how life feels overall, governments can build up knowledge about what really matters for high quality of life, taking everything into account. So today we have the second of our set of sessions that are running concurrently right now, and the one you're in is about how policy might change lives for the better through regulation related to income and consumption. You'll see we might define those somewhat broadly. Let me tell you one thing about the premise of today's session before I turn things over to our esteemed moderator. And as I said in the previous session, there's a tide that has turned in the last few years among happiness researchers. And the change is that we're ready to move beyond research and beyond applying the research in narrow circles and small institutions to what we call well-being policymaking and well-being budgeting. And that means actually acting with policy, changing what government does, where it spends our collective resources, all with an eye to making better lives. So the goal of today's session is to explore what policies we could be putting into action now or in the near future, and how good the evidence is for them. Et en mot pour nos participants francophones, les conférenciers feront leur présentation en anglais, mais vous êtes toujours également invités à poser des questions ou faire des commentaires en français. And it's now my great honor and pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion. James Hughes is the president and CEO of the Mission Brewery in Montreal, which is Quebec's largest center serving homeless men and women. Previously, Jim was executive lead, government and partner relations at the J.W. McConnell Foundation, and he served as president of the Graham Beck Foundation. And prior to that, Jim was New Brunswick's deputy minister of the Department of Social Development. He's also a graduate of McGill, as well as Queen's and Cambridge. And Jim is also a close collaborator and friend and advisory board member of our institute, the Institute for Health and Social Policy. So there we're currently co-leading with him an exciting homelessness prevention initiative. Jim, thank you very much for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Chris. That's a very kind and generous introduction, and I appreciate it very much. And welcome everybody to what I think will be a very exciting 2 hours together. I think we are going to have the chance to reflect together on what is essentially the most important thing, which is our happiness and our well-being. And we've brought together, I think, really quite a remarkable group of thinkers in this area on the research side, as well as on the policy and practice side, to help prime the pump as regards, as Chris said, turning ideas into action. Because really, it's that which really drives all of us, certainly on the ground. It is the primary mission of the Oldbury Mission, the organization I work with, to try to make life a little bit better. And we do that by treating homelessness through housing. There's so many other ideas, there's so many other ways to go about this at a micro level, at a macro level, that it's wonderful to have these gatherings, these milestones, where we can think about those things together. So as your moderator, it's my pleasure to try to move us along in that regard. But first of all, as some of you know from the previous session, the format is that we have three world-class researchers who will be giving you a presentation of 7 minutes in a video form. So those 3 videos will come up first. We'll tee those things up in just a second. Following those 3 videos, we have 3 policy and practitioner leads who will respond to what is being proposed in those particular videos, which are essentially pitches. These are pitches for what we should indeed do to advance the happiness agenda in a real, tangible way. And so we'll get some reaction from people on the ground regarding the feasibility, implementability of some of those ideas. And then following that, which is because it's only fair, we'll throw it back to the researchers to comment on the responses. So we'll get an iterative conversation going in that way. That'll be quite exciting. And then we'll have that conversation between those 6 for a little while to try to really squeeze out the best elements of both those and potentially other ideas that are equally powerful and perhaps even complementary to the ones that are being proposed. And then, of course, we're opening it up to you, and we're looking forward to having your questions as well. Please note, everyone, that we're going to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat. And via that method, they'll be relayed to me for me to share with the panel. So, and please be as specific as you possibly can as regards what your question is and whom you would like to address it amongst the panel. You can also just provide comments too, and that will be fun. We can read some of those comments out for the plenary. So I think that's really the format. That'll easily cover our 2 hours together. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then we'll get going with some of the videos. So I'm going to do all 6 introductions right away. So first of all, it's our pleasure to welcome Professor Paul Frijters. Professor Paul is a professor of Wellbeing Economics at the London School of Economics. Paul specializes in applied microeconometrics, including labor, happiness, and health economics, though he has also worked on pure theoretical topics in micro and macro fields. His main area of interest is in analyzing how socioeconomic variables affect the human life experience and the unanswerable economic mysteries in life. That is a life worth leading, is to try to answer some of those unanswerables. Next, Andrew Oswald is with us. Professor Oswald is a professor of economics and behavioral science at the University of Warwick. His research is principally in applied economics and quantitative social science. It currently includes his work on the COVID-19 crisis and health economics. In more normal times, Andrew also works on the empirical study of job satisfaction, human happiness, mental health, unemployment, labor productivity, and the influence of diet on psychological well-being. Welcome, Andrew. And last and certainly not least, Nick Powdthavee is a professor of behavioral science at Warwick Business School. He has held positions at the London School of Economics, University of Melbourne, Nanyang Technological University, and University of York. Nick specializes in well-being economics and behavioral economics and has published over 50 articles in these 2 broad areas. He is also the author of the popular science book called The Happiness Equation, The Surprising Economics of Our Most Valuable Asset. So there's a fantastic panel of researchers to give us some of their ideas on how to move the happiness file forward. So who will be responding to those ideas are firstly Derek Cook. Derek, thank you so much for being with us. Derek serves as the director of the Canadian Poverty Institute at Ambrose University in Calgary. In this role, he recently served on the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Poverty, providing input into the development of the Canadian Poverty Reduction Strategy. Previously, Derek worked for the City of Calgary, where he led the Mayor's Task Force on Poverty Reduction. Following Derek in response will be Marc Lee. Marc is a senior economist with the British Columbia office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, CCPA. Marc joined the CCPA in 1998 and is one of Canada's leading progressive commentators on economic and social policy issues. Marc led the CCPA's Climate Justice Project, which published a wide range of research on fair and effective approaches to climate action through integrating principles of social justice. Welcome, Marc. Lastly, Kari Wolanski. Kari is the director responsible for the development and implementation of Canada's draft quality of life framework released by Finance Canada in Budget 2021. So that is. She has over 20 years of social policy related experience in government, non-governmental organizations, and private sector consulting, primarily related to poverty and income security architecture. She has worked at the Privy Council office on the broad suite of policy measures introduced since 2015 to strengthen the middle class. Welcome, Kari. We're very excited to add your voice from inside of government on these very issues. So welcome, everyone. As I say, I think this is a fabulous group. And without further ado, let's get on to the videos.
Good afternoon from London again. I am Professor Paul Frijters, a wellbeing expert from the London School of Economics. And Chris Barrington-Leigh has asked me to talk about taxation. Now, in the background, you should know that government expenditures are actually very effective means of buying well-being in a country, much more so than individual expenditures, which just means that people spend more on expensive cars and expensive houses, which is good for them, but because it makes their neighbors jealous, doesn't mean we get much on aggregate. But government expenses, particularly in the area, of course, of health production, but also when it comes to mental health facilities, when it comes to education, when it comes to reducing crime, when it comes to improved neighborhood stability and community interaction, are highly cost-effective means of improving the well-being of the population. Which, of course, brings the question, well, from what do governments pay all these activities? And that goes from taxation. And so well-being people are naturally interested in paying for this highly effective welfare state by having a good tax base and by preventing tax evasion. And in recent decades, tax evasion amongst the very rich has really increased dramatically as far as we know. So we know from hidden sources like the Panama Papers, which uncovered a lot of tax avoidance and tax dodging schemes by the extremely rich in this world, effectively a whistleblower who gave us the lowdown on what the super rich were up to. We know from that kind of data source that particularly the top 0.01% of the population, so here we're thinking about the richest person in 10,000, is very actively hiding quite a large, substantial amount of the wealth and income that they are making. And they're doing that via 1,001 sometimes legal, sometimes illegal constructions, like pretending that they're working from the Cayman Islands, whereas really they're working in their own offices. It's like putting a patent that they may have on something that is very lucrative in Switzerland, and then pretending that that's where all the profits are being made, and hence avoiding the corporate taxes of the country where really that patent is put most to use. So there are 1,001 accounting tricks via which the very rich avoid taxes. And the question is, how are we going to get tax out of them and basically make them citizens again that contribute to the rest of society to the degree that they are capable of? Now, this is basically a question of how to tax. And it's extremely difficult because, of course, the rich are able to buy up the best tax brains, including those who used to be on the side of governments. But I do have some suggestions on this. Right? One suggestion, which is very old, which goes back centuries, is that you try and tax things which the rich have more than others, but they can't really do without, because it sort of makes them visibly rich, which is what they always want. And of course, the obvious one is that you tax large houses and you tax land, you tax soil. So land taxes is a great equalizing tax, and hence is always politically opposed by those who are the richest, precisely because they can't avoid it. But that is an obvious area to go into. And George Henderson wrote about this more than a century ago and sort of lobbied hard for it. In vain, he didn't get very far with it, but his ideas are still very much relevant for today. There is also a second type of taxation, which is upcoming, which the French have trialed with their digitax, and which was heavily opposed because it seemed to be successful, which is to effectively have a kind of reverse taxation, which is instead of asking people, oh, how much money have you made in this country, and would you please send us some proportion of that, you basically just send them a bill, and they may object, but that is how much they should pay unless something else happens, right? Like something that to your satisfaction proves that they didn't make that amount of money. So this is a kind of reverse proof taxation, which you don't want to do with the majority of the population, to which you believe there's good faith taxation, but you do want to do with the biggest players in a country. And one of the ways to do that is to send a big bill to internet companies operating on your soil, like, of course, Google, Facebook, Apple, but also these intermediary providers like Uber or other platforms, and say, look, we think you make this amount of money in our country. We want you to pay so many million or billion to be able to keep operating in our country. And what that needs is it needs new institutions. The particular thing you then want as a country is to be able to have what is called denial of access, right? You want to be able to shut down these large internet companies if they don't comply with the tax bill you've just sent them. So you then need to start thinking of, okay, do I actually have the weaponry in order to force particular countries and individuals and companies into taxation, which they previously didn't want to do, and they were heavily opposed. But this is definitely the area in which many nation states have to go towards in order to make sure that they have the tax base to fund the welfare state. And you see lots of moves in that direction. And I think from a well-being perspective, we should think constructively about what options are on the table.
I think advertising should be heavily restricted in modern society. The point of advertising, in my judgment, is to make people feel dissatisfied with their lives. Serendipitously, as I have to give a little talk today on advertising, today my new copy of The Economist arrived, so I thought I'd look inside. The very first page, the inner page, is an advertisement for Rolex wristwatches for men. I looked up the price, and the cheapest Rolex is about $6,000 US. This is bought by people who are already carrying a mobile phone on which they can read the time. Therefore, my judgment is that this is all about status seeking, or in a sense, to create negative emotional externalities on other kinds of individuals. If we look further in, we come to what I think it would not be unfair to call banal advertising. This is a young woman in a tight-fitting, some sort of shimmery catsuit. And what is this person advertising? An MBA at a business school that I'm afraid I've barely heard of. Then if we turn to the very back page of the brand new Economist, it may be sitting on your desk too, then we get this rather attractive picture of young children running into the ocean, enjoying themselves. Then one notices they're carrying handbags, and this is a Louis Vuitton advertisement where the cheapest handbag, to my knowledge, made by Louis Vuitton is about $1,500 to $1,800 US, and of course they go up into the many thousands. Now, is this a sensible thing for our society? We could think about the positive side of advertising. Let me read you a quote. Advertising gives the opportunity to companies to highlight their unique selling points. This stimulates competition for consumers. This translates to higher quality and lower prices. Well, this quote comes from the World Federation of Advertisers, so one might doubt its objectivity. I prefer the quote from someone called Will Rogers, an actor and comedian. Advertising is the art of convincing people to spend money that they do not have to buy things that they do not need. Although that's not an empirical economic statement, that my sense is that Will Rogers is right. If we wanted to, we could ban advertising. We do so in certain cases for smoking, unhealthy food for children, and so on. I think there's a case for bearing in mind the negative externalities produced all over the modern world by these kinds of advertisements. And what underlies this, in my view, is a utility function defined on relative kinds of things. That notion goes back to Thorstein Veblen, to Robert Frank, to Richard Easterlin, James Dewsbury, and so on. In economics jargon, it's the idea that utility is defined on relative consumption. In that case, when I buy something, I'm simply making you feel worse off. The great philosopher Bertrand Russell said 100 years ago, of all the characteristics of ordinary human nature, envy is the most unfortunate. Whoever wishes to increase human happiness must diminish envy. That's Bertrand Russell, 1930, in a book called The Conquest of Happiness. I believe that the whole point of nearly all advertising is to make people envious. And I can't see why that's a good thing for our society. It would be fair to say that applied economics lacks enough studies, convincing studies on what advertising does to human welfare. But I have had a hand with some co-authors in one. This was published in a recent volume in honor of Richard Easterlin. We take data on about 1 million randomly sampled people, 30 years of data. These are pooled cross-section equations using the Eurobarometers across 27 countries. So we estimate fairly conventional, though it's a big data set, life satisfaction equations with country fixed effects, year dummies, all of the normal control variables. And what we find is that lagged national advertising total value enters negatively in our life satisfaction equation. In other words, when advertising rises in countries all over the world, in the following years, people's feeling of life satisfaction declines. That's the job of advertising, in my opinion, but it's not something as a society we want. If you ever watch English soccer, and I do a lot, you'll realize about 2 or 3 years ago, the so-called Premier League allowed long advertising hoardings, flashing lights during a match right on the edge of the pitch. That was for the advertisers, specifically designed to distract fans from what they wanted to see of football. And one of the most commonly noticed advertisements comes from a company called Bet365. You may want to know that last week, the Financial Times reported that the CEO of Bet365 this year will pay herself approximately $600 million this year in salary. She will earn $600 million this year in total compensation. Is that what we want in society? Is that what advertisements are leading us to? Another clear example is the way that motor vehicle advertisements are designed. I believe, and I hope you agree, ladies and gentlemen, it's all about stimulating envy. Nobody's thinking about carbon emissions. Nobody's thinking about what's really good for society. Advertisers simply want to take our money and sell us goods that we don't need. Modern motor vehicles last for 30 years, but of course they want to pressurize us psychologically to keep buying every 2 or 3 years. If you're interested in brain science, I would strongly recommend a paper in the Journal of Public Economics in 2011 by Thomas Doman and co-authors, where they show that you can actually see envy, relative comparisons in the brain. The point of advertising, as I said at the beginning, in my opinion, is to make people dissatisfied with their lives. And I'm afraid I don't see why we tolerate that in modern society. Thank you for listening.
Hi everyone, my name is Nick Powdthavee. I am a professor of behavioral science here at Warwick Business School. And today I would like to talk to you about a policy that is related to income inequality, rank income, and happiness. But before I go into the policy, let me just say a little bit about 3 observations that I have from the studies that I have conducted and many other people have conducted. So the first observation is that people care very deeply about rank income. Now, what I mean by rank here is that people care about where they rank in an income distribution, right? So even holding income constant, a move up the income ladder makes us happier. But holding income constant, a move down in terms of ranking position, make us really, really unhappy. So that's the first observation that I want to start off with. So, and this explains why, and many of you would have heard the Easterlin paradox before, where the rich, at the cross section, the rich are happier with their life than the poor. But as the society progressed, as the country become richer and richer over time, the aggregate happiness doesn't really increase with it over time, simply because for every winner in terms of income rank, there's always a loser. The second observation is related to the first, and that is the loss aversion in happiness, really. So despite the fact that we can become happier by moving up the income rank, the falling down of the income rank actually hurt us, empirically speaking, about twice as much. Now, what that means is that it's not really a zero-sum game where the pursuit of status makes people on average the same in terms of happiness as the country becomes richer over time. In fact, there is a possibility that even the country becomes richer over time, the average happiness could decline, simply because for every winner, they become happier, but for every loser, they lose even much more than the winner are gaining in terms of happiness. So losses here hurt twice, almost empirically speaking, about twice as much as the equivalent gain in happiness from an income increase. And finally, the third observation, and this is based on a study that I did with my colleagues, is that this effect of rank income, how much rank income can buy our happiness, and how much a fall in rank income could hurt our happiness, is exacerbated by income inequality. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by this is that in a very unequal society, the gain that we get from moving up the income rank is much bigger than in a much more equal country. And in a similar way, the fall from coming down the income rank is going to be much bigger in a highly unequal country comparing to equal country. Now, putting all these three together, what does that tell us? It tells us that the pursuit of status it might be good as an individual if we can move up the income rank, but collectively speaking, it's quite bad. But it gets a lot worse in a much more unequal society, because each marginal effect of income rank on happiness gets kind of amplified, whether it's a positive and negative in those societies. So the policy that I'm trying to propose, and actually people have talked about this already before, there are two policies actually. So the first policy is the equals policy recommended by Robert Frank from Cornell University about progressive consumption tax. So instead of income tax, progressive income tax, they talk about progressive consumption tax, where the more you consume, the more tax you have to pay, but the tax itself will not go into your income. So people might be okay, relatively more okay with that kind of a policy. But the policy I'm trying to propose is a slightly different, slightly more bold than that, because we know that we want to be live in a society where the pursuit of income rank doesn't give us as much hit in happiness as we want to, and the fall wouldn't be as bad as it would be in an unequal society. So the policy I'm trying to talk about here, or tell you about here, is that we could create a curriculum for that teaches young kids, students, about the importance of luck in success. We know that one of the main reasons why income inequality persists in many countries is due to the ideology that, well, income rank buys happiness, so therefore we want to to keep that incentive to move up, and so the more unequal you are, the more gain we get from that. And also the idea that meritocracy, that if you work hard, you can benefit from that, so therefore it's okay, and that's why income inequality exists. But we know from evidence that luck plays a greater role in our success than effort itself. So if we all believe that efforts, basically, if we believe that the poor are poor because they're lazy, we would never want to redistribute our income. But if we can teach our children very early on that, well, actually luck has a lot to do with this. We know from evidence that we're more inclined to redistribute our wealth, to reduce that inequality in our society, and therefore could have potential payoff in reducing this rank income effect on our life satisfaction. And just to end this talk, I think this would be a very cost-effective policy to implement. Perhaps I wouldn't get as much backlash as progressive consumption tax proposed by Robert Frank, because people don't like taxation in general. But I think if we get our children to kind of learn that success that we get in our lives, luck has a lot of important role to play with that. And therefore, if we could redistribute, we should. And that's it, really. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much to our three researchers. Fighting tax evasion, advertising restrictions, and Nick cheated a little bit by proposing both progressive consumption tax and a very interesting idea around a pedagogical tool. So really interesting, wonderful primer for our conversation going forward. And now I'm going to turn it over to our respondents in order: Derek, Marc, then Kari. I just want to remind each of you three that 5 minutes is really the time you're given to respond in any way you want. So I'll keep an eye on that too, as a bit of the policeman here, and pass it over to Derek for his insights. Derek.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of this workshop today. I was really intrigued by all three of the presentations that we heard, because I think they provide unique pathways toward well-being that we don't often talk about. And while they're all quite different, I think they're quite interrelated and build on each other in really important ways, because they speak to two different aspects of well-being that are important, which is our paradigm and our structures. So because paradigm tends to inform structure, I want to begin by talking about paradigm, starting with the discussion by Dr. Oswald about advertising, because this strikes me to be at the heart of what I've come to believe is the myth of scarcity. So as we know, economics talks about the fact that we have supposedly limited resources but unlimited needs, and yet we're in this paradox where we've never had more productive capacity collectively in history. And as early as the 1970s, Keynes was talking about the post-scarcity society. He said that the problem is not a lack of resources, but it's actually a finite potential to consume. And so in most cases, the scarcities that we experience are either created because we restrict access to resources, or we restrict production, or they're induced in the ways that Dr. Oswald described. And these scarcities are themselves designed to confer power and advantage to certain groups of people, which amplifies inequality. And as Dr. Oswald notes, that further fuels our scarcity in this rather vicious circle. So in that context, the idea of banning advertising is pretty bold and innovative. Having said that, I do question its feasibility for a couple of reasons. First, due to the nature of telecommunications, now, information flows are no longer within the control of national governments, so advertising would continue to exist on all of those platforms that are beyond the reach of government, of national government. But also, a lot of our economy is structured to rely on advertising revenue. So banning advertising would actually incur an important financial cost. I also think there may be some free speech challenges that could be made, and think it may not survive a charter challenge. Yet, despite some of these challenges, I wonder if a more targeted approach could be useful. It seems like our senses are, literally under assault in all aspects of our lives from advertising. So could we commit to carving out some advertising-free zones, such as in public spaces, or could we impose limits on the amount of advertising in any media or space? As this would involve a loss of revenue, there may be a role for the state to step in to try to offset that financial hit too. Well, the second proposal by Dr. Powdthavee is also interesting because it gets at what I believe is the second key myth that informs our paradigm, drives society, which is the myth of the autonomous individual, because none of us are really autonomous, are we? And this myth, when paired with the myth of scarcity, is used to justify vast inequalities. So tackling that myth can open the door for a new narrative to emerge. And the idea of luck is really important in that, but I think it also needs to include a structural dimension, because there are structural reasons why some might appear to be luckier than others. Similarly, there are structural reasons why bad luck for some is a mere inconvenience, while for others it turns into a deep crisis. Racism, patriarchy, colonization, for example, often have a great deal to do with luck. So it would be important for the curriculum that Dr. Powdthavee proposes to incorporate these concepts as well. Now, what I think is interesting about these proposals is that by speaking to these myths of scarcity and autonomy, they strike at the heart of what compromises our well-being, which is this distorted paradigm. And until we shift that paradigm, the other changes that we need to make to improve our well-being will be difficult. So the third proposal by Dr. Frijters gets to that structural dimension. And this proposal, while possibly effective in reducing inequality, may suffer a feasibility challenge precisely because of our paradigm that is based on those myths of scarcity and autonomy. However, if we're able to change that narrative in the ways proposed by Dr. Oswald and Dr. Powdthavee, proposals like Dr. Frijters, it may become possible. So in conclusion, I suggest that the interaction between these three proposals may hold promise if we can combine a shift in narrative with that concrete structural change. So changing both paradigm and structure are necessary elements of a broad program that could enhance our social well-being.
Derek, thank you very much. Very, very insightful. Love the mythology busting that you're starting us off on. I think that's tremendous. Marc, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. This is great content. I will note that I'm the fifth man in a row to speak. So, we'll get a little balance next. I guess I wanted to focus my remarks on what I thought was a common thread in the three proposals, which is the excess consumption by the wealthy, and manifests in different ways and in different presentations. So we were asked to comment on the feasibility, and I think we're actually at a moment where the feasibility of things like wealth taxes and higher taxes on the rich is actually possible. There's been tons of work in the media, including by my organization, commenting on how much wealthier the wealthiest have become during the COVID pandemic. So the political feasibility part, I think, is actually the least challenging here. But I think there are some important conversations that come up in what I heard. So I'll just do them in order. Paul, I totally agree around tax evasion by the rich. I totally agree around taxing land. It's an efficient tax base economically, because it's very hard to avoid. You can't move your land out of the country, so to speak. So the real question is, in a place like Vancouver, where I live, we tax property, and the vast majority of that, about 90%, is already based on land. I think there's a strong case to be made for shifting increases in that further on to land, that there'd be a sort of a tax shift away from structures and buildings and towards land. So the question is really about, should we have higher property tax rates, countering some of the lottery winnings we've seen in real estate, the product of dumb luck, which links to Nick's presentation. And I think more progressive property taxation, so that higher rates are placed on the higher valued properties, something that we introduced in British Columbia a few years ago, although it could be much more progressive, is another way to think about it. We also have a lot of very favorable tax treatment around investments in housing, particularly for principal residences in Canada, which is very biased against renters. So there's a lot we could do to rebalance around taxing land. And in I think doing so, one of the spin-off benefits of that would be that you would create incentives as well for increasing densification and better urban form towards what urban planners call more complete communities, getting away from car-oriented suburbs and more walkable, bikeable communities. Paul's other suggestion around the sort of reverse tax, I have some questions about how that would operate in practice. Like, it seems to me that taxation has a legal framework and basis and justification for the rates that are charged. And the idea that we just sort of present a bill, it's not entirely clear to me how that would work and what that bill is supposed to represent. Although it sounds a lot to some ideas I've heard in the past, where you would kind of, as people paid their taxes, you'd give them sort of a list of what those services were paid for. So I'm not sure if that is sort of the idea behind that. And I question whether that would work for the richest among us, in the sense that they will pay much more in taxes than they get in terms of public services. Although you could potentially have a line item for protection of property that would be a part of their tax base. But I also question whether this is the right framing, whether that's putting the contribution as a market transaction, not as an expectation for someone being a member of a society and contributing to the public good, and largely because of the luck that they've had over their lifetimes. For corporations, again, some legal basis for taxing, Amazon and all the other companies could easily be done. So Nick talked about progressive consumption tax. I would argue in Canada, we already have a progressive consumption tax through the income tax system because of the light treatment of taxation on residential property and housing, and lower taxes on capital gains and provisions for pensions and RRSPs, or retirement savings, to be excluded from taxable income. So in a sense, the vast majority of income is already taxed as consumption in Canada. Doing so, I think, it has the advantages, as you mentioned, about it does maintain rank, but lowers after-tax income, and that after-tax income can pay for public services that are of great benefit to everyone, and to income transfers that improve the plight of the poorest among us. I agree, teaching the importance of luck would be great, but maybe this is just one more meme in a world that's just covered in memes. If anything, we need to teach the importance of luck, not so much to children, but to the wealthy. Again, coming back to that point that a lot of the gain that they have in their position in life is due to their genes and the family they were born to, and in the country they grew up in, and other happenstance things that occurred, like a odd meeting at the Granite Club with someone really important that changes your life. So we should also be thinking about taxing luck, taxing those windfall gains from real estate, or taxing windfall gains from the stock market. And I think that's very justifiable, and that's also a good tax base. Finally, to Andrew, I would agree with Derek around the not likelihood that we would be able to ban advertising. I do think there is an element that's not just about creating dissatisfaction with people's lives. There is an element of giving people information about what is actually out there for good or ill. But in terms of the pervasiveness of advertising in our society and its relationship economically to media of all forms as a business model, banning advertising would be very challenging. So I would shift that back towards maybe we should be taxing advertising and using the proceeds of that advertising to fund public outreach campaigns by nonprofits, so that we are getting a more diverse and representative mix of ideas in the public marketplace. Maybe we do put absolute limits on the total base of advertising in terms of places it can go. And interestingly, you mentioned football, where they actually have advertising on the uniforms of the teams themselves, which to me, in my North American mindset, just is completely beyond the pale. But in sports is a great example of just the excesses of advertising and how that's fueled inequality in terms of incomes for the players and owners. So I think it's possible to think about a taxation regime that would reduce the amount of advertising space, but would improve the distribution of advertising time across society and different actors. And that could be also very broadly progressive in terms of that tax, so that the big companies, the telephone companies and the car companies, that you could have a really high tax rate on them. It would be a very efficient tax base, or even other measures to sort of put hard limits on the amount that they can put forward. But I think that straight up banning advertising would be more of a challenge. So thank you so much for being able to comment on all these.
Thank you, Mark. Terrific. The idea of taxing luck is one maybe we'll explore a little bit more. I like that framing a lot. So Kari, over to you.
So thanks for having me today. It's a really interesting discussion. And I must say, so I specialize in income security architecture. So for me, the questions I'm used to thinking about are things like, what is a basic standard of living in Canada? How do we measure that? How do we know who's falling below that standard of living? And what do we do about that? Are there gaps in our social safety net? Where are they from the policy standpoint, delivery standpoint, like benefit take up, that sort of thing. And none of these pitches are really about that. And so I think that's what's really interesting about the quality of life framing and the subjective well-being metric in particular, is it takes us to really different places and causes us to ask really different questions. And I think that's its value. And in a sense, when I looked at a theme, all of these pitches are actually looking at ways to make income differences matter less, which is kind of a really interesting flip from how I'm used to thinking about things. So we talked about, reducing demand for things we can't afford. We talked about increasing our acknowledgement of our good fortune and our empathy towards those who are less fortunate. And we talked about how to increase the availability or the tax revenue for public goods that enhance quality of life regardless of income. So I think they're all very interesting perspectives on a question, and worth noting, since you've asked me to talk about feasibility, that these aren't, in the world of income security, we're usually looking at very large expenditures, and that's not what these proposals are, which I think is a really interesting feature of the conversation. So I'm going to start by talking about advertising. I think a ban might be a bridge too far. As my previous panel mate mentioned, we have a lot of free services, media, digital space, for example, that are supported by advertising. There'd be some losses there. There's also some issues around sort of new companies, new firms starting up. How do they get to market without advertising, and that sort of consumer choice and preferences piece. But we do have levers in this space, and I think there's some really interesting questions you've asked about how advertising affects people. So we've got levers in the public health space around smoking, et cetera. We've got CRTC space, regulates around kids and alcohol at events, that sort of thing. We've got the Competition Bureau that looks at truth in advertising, and also creating a competitive environment. And we've got industry self-regulation, which plays quite an important role here. And that includes, for example, standards like not playing on people's superstitions and fears or denigrating people. And I particularly, since I am the woman on this panel, want to point to a 1981 CRTC task force that looked at sex role stereotyping in broadcast media. And has informed continuing practice on gender portrayal. And what struck me about your examples is, for example, you have the woman in the cat suit, you have the Rolex. And in those cases, it seemed to me like the target market wasn't me. And it was really around sort of status seeking and a particular identity of masculinity. And it occurs to me that there might be more we could do in the space of looking at how advertising standards concern the impact, the tactics that marketing has and how it affects people. I think that's a viable space to do more work. And I think it is in the context of the explosion of different marketing surfaces, the digital environment, the micro-targeting, the advent of influencers. It's hard to even know sometimes, product placement. It's hard to even know sometimes exactly where ads end and begin. So I've put back to you perhaps a bit of a different framing. In terms of curriculum, so schools are provincial. It's an area I know less about. There's local boards, might be another surface to interact with. There's also lots of activities that kids engage in beyond the school that help to sort of influence norms. One area that I think might help with that sort of empathy building, sense of good fortune, idea of social solidarity, we do invest in the federal government is youth service investments. I think that's an interesting area that could help with the sort of awareness building that you're interested in. And I think important to think about luck, but also privilege. And that conversation is particularly pertinent right now in the context of lots of work around anti-racism. I also wanted to talk about a different space than curriculum to try to change that narrative, which is about so what is our cultural identity? What came to mind, and it's a bit of a non sequitur from your curriculum starting point, but was this ad that really stayed with me from the Olympics. It was a Tim Hortons ad. I'm not really a Tim Hortons coffee drinker, but this ad really kind of nailed what for me the Canadian identity is, and it was an ad where there was clearly a recent immigrant to Canada, and he gathers together this package of snowsuits and some Tim Hortons coffee for his arriving family who he meets at the airport in the winter. And it just really summed up what is the Canadian story of identity. I don't think it's a perfect story. We have work to do on Indigenous peoples, where they sit in that identity, what came before, and problematizing that. But I do think it's a powerful narrative that speaks to the core message that you are raising about empathy, the sense of our good fortune, social mobility, and why we care about investing in social services. And I think that's sort of a surface to build on. And so I guess my question back to you is, there's curriculum, but what are the other ways that we can develop the sort of empathy and social support that are required to support the good things? So now on to taxation. So this is what we need to support the good things. And I was particularly struck by that phrasing about how tax bases and the government decisions through policy and investments are effective at increasing happiness. And in particular, I think they do tend to address the tragedy of the commons and choices we might not make if left to our own devices that are sort of in our best interests. We're not always perfect at it, but I think that's a really interesting point that you raised. In terms of land tax, as my previous colleague mentioned, we have a property tax and capital gains tax are core kind of ways that we tax in this space. I think there is an important question about whether we should look at whether the assessed value of property flat rate model is enough. And as mentioned, there are some places that are starting to look at that differently. Is that a progressive enough model for us, particularly given the windfall gains that some Canadians have had the good fortune to have? And I think, so my question back is in that space. What levers do we already have that we could work with? There is a lot happening in the taxation space. I think I want to highlight sort of a delivery practice that was mentioned around sort of sending the bill, calculating the bill, rather than the sort of starting from the self-assessment. I think that's an interesting model. A lot of times when discussions are raised about sort of taxation, there's this kind of implicit assumption there's only so much we can do because people will go elsewhere. And so I want to point to an interesting development, which is sort of recent signals from the Biden administration about trying to sort of put a floor beneath that through international collaboration. I think that has some interesting and promising potential in the future. So basically, you've provided pitches, and I'm giving you back questions. So could our advertising standards better focus on the impact, not just who is portrayed in the ad or what the portrayal looks like, but also the impact and what's being targeted and how that affects humans? What tools, curriculum and otherwise, do we have to change the narratives about social solidarity, empathy, privilege, and entitlement? And a very simple question, could property taxes be more progressive? So thanks for that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Kari, thanks for some wonderful observations and insights, I think challenging us to think about these issues more broadly, thinking about the expenditure side, which we may not be getting into, but and those income security gaps that are so glaring in so many ways. and then ending on that whole idea, I think, of the minimum taxes. And is there such a thing, which I think dovetails nicely with some of the presentations. But it's now a chance we can send it over to Andrew and Nick, perhaps, to comment on the responses. Paul is unfortunately not with us. He's in the concurrent session that's going on. So he can't be in two places at once, although I think they tried to see if we he could do double time, but I don't think it worked out. So maybe we could start with, we'll do it in reverse order from the presentations. Nick, would you like to go first?
Thank you very much, James. Thank you also to Kari, Mark, and Derek for really interesting and thoughtful comments about my presentation. And just very quickly, just to thank Chris as well. I was actually a part of the scientific committee for this conference, and I helped Chris and the committee inviting people, think about people to invite, and the person who I didn't tell them to invite was myself. So thank you, Chris, for extending that invitation for me to be here, and I really nice to be here. So just to, I wrote it all down here. I think just to go to Derek and Kari's comments first, and which I really like, and that is the cultural identity and what else could we do. And maybe it's tied into Mark's comment as well about maybe it's not just about giving lessons to children, but really it's the very wealthy that should have this kind of lesson. Now, I don't really have a perfect answer to this, but one thing that I was just thinking about regarding what else could we do. From what I know, and maybe the psychologists in this room are probably at a better place at answering this question better than I do, and maybe we could open the floor up later, is that humans are, we rationalize things that happen to us. And that happens probably much more frequently among the very, very rich, that, I fully deserve the wealth that I have. And that's going to be very, very difficult to undo. Right? And that's why I thought it might be more feasible to start young. But obviously, I agree with you completely that it is the very wealthy now that might need that kind of lesson as well. One thing that popped into my mind very quickly was that there is a tool, a psychological tool. I don't know how you would implement this. Maybe you can discuss this a bit further. Is that when we want to try to change somebody's mind about something, whether it's to do with whether I deserve my wealth, whether or not I should trust the vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine, is that we tend to believe that we are things even before we try to explain it. So there is this bias called the illusion of explanatory depth, where when we probe them, say, can you please try to explain what you believe that you really understand? They can't, or they're not able to. So when they try to explain, for example, how does bicycle work, you might say, I really know how bicycle works, but when can you explain me in detail how it actually works? People actually struggle, and people might not know it as well. And this could apply the same way as meritocracy, that they feel that they really deserve the wealth that they have. But then when you probe them and trying to get them to explain, okay, do you actually know how it works, how you get to this wealth, whether luck has anything to do with it? Of course, this has to be researched, and it's something that I'm interested to do further research in the future. Can we actually change people's minds, make them mellow a little bit more about, oh yeah, actually, it's luck. Luck got me to this point. So that might be one of the tools that we could have. It could be through workshop. It could be through, I don't know what it could be, but that could be one thing that they could do. And just very, very quickly before I pass on to Andrew, I completely agree with the cultural identity. I think luck comes in very different forms, and I think we should engage people in the educational sector to try to build up a good curriculum, to build a good way to do that. I just don't have a perfect answer to that myself. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it on to Andrew.
Andrew.
Right, I'll start, if I may, by asking James Hughes a question. I love Montreal. I haven't been there for a few years. I've been in Vancouver more recently. Would I be right in thinking that I can't smoke in a restaurant in Montreal?
You are correct.
Would I be right in thinking I can't smoke in a university lecture in McGill or one of the other Montreal universities?
Correct again.
Right. I'd like to ask my three erudite commentators whether they're in favor of rescinding those banning laws.
Why don't we take that as given? Because I think you're absolutely right. It's very interesting, the path you're on.
All three, Derek and Mark and Kari, have said that we couldn't ban advertising. The companies need the money. We have to think about freedom and so on. So, of course, this is a slightly extreme way to put it, but I think it's important for those who say such things to also say, are they willing to rescind? Are they desirous of rescinding the ban on things like smoking? And whatever they say, and the point, I guess, is that we do ban things. And now, why do we do that? And I'll let my three distinguished commentators come back in a second, but why do we ban things? Well, I suppose it's because we side more with physicians than with economists a lot of the time. Some of you will have had education in one or both of those. And economists teach their students from the start that basically humans are sensible and make the right decisions for themselves. And doctors basically teach medical students from the start that humans have no idea what they're doing to be sensible. And we need to explain that they should eat fruit and vegetables and not smoke and take plenty of exercise, because otherwise they'll just do completely the wrong thing. And the older I get, the more I think I should have studied medicine rather than do a PhD in economics. I'll stop there because I've had my 7 minutes after all.
Thank you, Andrew. Very, very provocative. And you're absolutely right. Freedom of expression itself is curtailed in many different contexts. And maybe, I don't know if any of the three respondents would like to have a word about that. When, if in fact the case is made, and Andrew has tried to make it, that there is a negative relationship between the increase in spending on advertising and happiness. It doesn't help us. And if we want to reverse that, what are we willing to pay to do so? Are we willing to consider legal barriers, even as in the case of smoking? Let's spend just a little bit of time on this, and then let's move on to the taxation question after. And maybe Derek, why don't you go first? Let's try to keep it fairly brief, and Mark afterwards. Kari, you'll hit cleanup if you don't mind. Derek.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. We certainly do ban lots of things. However, if we want to take the example of smoking, we actually didn't, make a blanket ban on smoking. We said there are certain spaces where you can and cannot smoke, and I think that might be, a positive way forward on this advertising. If we can, increasingly expand those zones of, where we're not allowed to advertise. I mean, we do it all already, right? Like billboards, or I'm not sure in other parts of the country, but there are some places where you're not allowed to put billboards on the side of the road. Can we, make sure, can we get rid of advertising on the sides of our transit or on, as pointed out, on our sports jerseys, right? I mean, if we can start to restrict where it is allowed to occur, I think then we might, get some relief from this thing.
Mark?
Well, I think I would agree with Andrew's fundamental proposition about the damages and negative externalities associated with advertising. I think the three of us are making a comment more on the political feasibility, and also just thinking about what are the tools in the toolbox here. So banning is one of them, and I think I suggested that on the margin there definitely scope for some bans in terms of the restrictions in terms of public space or other things. But I think taxation is also an important tool as well, and a well-designed taxation framework can create a more equal distribution of voice in society, maybe even promoting some of the ideas around luck that Nick suggested before. And that we could do that in a highly progressive manner so that we raised a lot of money, particularly from the really largest companies as well. So, and eventually maybe we would get to a full advertising ban in particular places. But, bit by bit, even with things like, climate change and cars spewing carbon, we have carbon taxes, and then now we're only finally moving into the stage where we're gonna ban eventually internal combustion engine vehicles. So we need multiple tools.
A really interesting analogy. I was thinking the same thing. Kari.
Yeah, I take your point that bans can be an effective tool in targeted areas. I think I was perhaps understanding it as a more broader umbrella. I think that the case that you've mentioned is an interesting one, and there may very well be others. And I will also take a moment to say that I think the core problem that you're defining is a very important one. I think there's also something changing that's important to acknowledge, which is the advent of digital advertising and micro targeting, and the level of perhaps manipulation that's possible, that is, as you say, sort of intended to drive need or manufacture need where there was none. I've certainly been targeted recently by all sorts of new goods. For example, luxury stay-at-home wear, a need I never had, never even considered really existed, but suddenly COVID is here. And so with it, new needs are being created. So I think you're onto something important, and I didn't mean to sort of disregard that core message. I also, there's a sort of a throwaway point that you made that I think is important about well, if I think back to the early days of smoking and how they changed the advertising framework, a lot of it was about not making smoking glamorous. And you pointed to the sort of cars and the consumption of carbon. And, perhaps we're at a time where we need to be thinking about not making excessive use of carbon glamorous or something along those lines. So I agree with many of your problem definitions. I think we'd have to think carefully about where that sits, how to make sure that, for example, new firms, we don't default to firms that are already known because they've already had their chance to advertise, and it's hard for others to get into the market, and the value of consumer choice in that space. So I think it's a toolkit that should be examined. Nick, I wanted to pull out something also that you said about rank order, and this relates to carbon as well, and changes, people's changes in the distribution and just transitions in particular. And so I used to work in employment insurance policy, and at that time, at the time of the commodities downturn, we received a lot of letters from people who were very high paid individuals who'd lost work and just weren't able to replace their earnings. This is similar to sort of the manufacturing sector in Ontario. People who are older workers lost work and weren't able to replace their earnings. And so that sort of sense of, meriting your place in the order of things can drive some really negative outcomes if you aren't able to continue to replace the income that you've grown accustomed to. That has equity implications. If you keep the distribution the same, you're not making it more equal. And so I think there are some important issues to tease out, and I don't know the solutions to those problems. But I thought that your three problems that you articulated at the outset of your arguments were very well made.
Yeah, thanks, Kari. Great stuff. I want to maybe spin us over to that taxation piece. We've spent a fair bit of time on it, and I just give everyone just a little bit of an extra round. There's this I sense an emerging consensus that our overall wellness and happiness would be improved with a more progressive, I'm going to test this with you, a more progressive taxation regime on the wealthy, if not super wealthy, that the redistribution of those, that wealth earned perhaps through luck or otherwise would have a greater impact on the wellness of those to whom it was distributed in some way, and that therefore it is really a priority area for policy development, so that we can even the playing field a little bit more with I think the commensurate happiness increase that may come with it. And I just want to test that. And if you had to pick in the universe of taxation opportunities that we've been talking about here, where would you put your chips in? Maybe Andrew, can I start off with you on that?
Yes, of course, I've been thinking about how to set taxes for many, many decades as one kind of an economist or social scientist and another. I would say looking at the balance of what we might call the statistical research on happiness and human well-being, probably the key thing is slightly different, and it's more that something that Kari might be sympathetic to and probably thinks a lot about, and that is from the very earliest days when I was looking at so-called happiness equations, we found that really one of the biggest effects was coming from what you might call social safety nets, or in other words, the generosity of the support at the bottom. And perhaps that's quite intuitive, really, because if you can avoid misery, real unhappiness, then of course that tends to do a lot for the average level of happiness. So I don't know about taxes on the top end. I would concentrate on getting higher minimum wages and so on. In other words, focusing more on the bottom end. Now, it's very natural for people to look at rich men and women, and I do, and one thinks it's quite absurd that people all have all this money they can't possibly spend. One thing to bear in mind, and this is difficult for the British taxpayer, is that even if we had very punitive income taxes on rich people, high income earners in this country, it wouldn't actually generate that much cash. In my country, and almost certainly Canada, to get money from income kinds of taxes, big money, you need to be getting at people who are earning, let's say, $50,000 or $60,000 or 40,000 sterling and so on. There is a role to do something about the very big earners, but for that, we're really talking about trying to redistribute wealth. It's not the income taxes that matter, and we don't know how to do the wealth taxes, I'm afraid, in my judgment. But what I'm saying here is that I'd focus more on the bottom end, you might say.
Nick, where do you stand on this in a very pithy way?
Well, just to stay within the same area of luck, I mean, I would argue for progressive inheritance tax as a possible way that, as you know, that people are very resistant. They feel that the tax is taking away from their efforts, and a lot of earned income, they feel, even though a lot of it is through luck, they might be very resistant of a rising income tax. But inheritance tax, in many ways, that is luck that is passing on to the next generation. So there is a possible way that if there is a change in the paradigm, as Derek said, to understand the role of luck better, and that could tap into the wealth tax that Andrew talks about, because it's taxed once, and that could be calculated. So maybe through that kind of taxation, progressive inheritance tax, in a way that the very rich will be taxed a lot more than the poor anyway. So that might also answer slightly to Andrew's point. Yeah,
estate taxes are a really exciting area that I think need a lot more reflection, and how to implement them in progressive ways is not easy. Maybe could I carry any thoughts from a government perspective on that? I mean, income security gaps, things like the Canada Child Benefit, things like the Canadian Housing Benefit, they need to be funded. Those are big programs. And with COVID, the Canadian government is just swimming in debt, in my view, perfectly justifiably. But could we close that gap a little bit with as big a play on the revenue side, on the taxation side, through one of the programs that are being discussed here? Realistically, don't, as Marc perhaps alluded to, aren't the circumstances just perfect for that?
So I'm going to begin with a caveat to say that I'm not representing the tax policy branch of my department. You're getting some of my unvarnished views. That said, you asked where we would go in. I would go in with the carbon tax. I think, we have an existential crisis on our hands. We need to change some behavior. We have a tool to do that. And we also have a regime here that's been introduced that offsets the cost of that by redirecting money back to the lower income households, rural communities, et cetera, that are most affected. So, I mean, in terms of the starting point, I think that's it. And growing that over time to the extent that social license will allow, will drive some of those changing consumption patterns. I wouldn't rule out the other levers that others have talked about. I agree that, we've made a lot of progress actually in recent years in Canada on poverty reduction for some of our core risk groups, seniors, lone seniors, lone parents, quite impressively so. And even during COVID, by my estimation, based on the income supports that were made available on a temporary basis, which were particularly generous at the lower end of the income distribution, I don't think it's going to have hurt. It may have even helped our progress on poverty reduction. There are still groups to think about. Chief in my mind would be Indigenous peoples and people with disabilities. I think we still have more work to do on making sure that everybody who's entitled gets the support that that is available to them. A problem that it's difficult to even understand why it exists, but it does. So that's sort of job one, is making sure that everyone who is entitled to support is getting it. And then I think that's sort of the order. So I've skirted some of the core issues. I think there's room for further discussions. But as you say, there's a lot in flux, a lot moving right now. A lot is changing in terms of the role of government, the level of the space that government has taken up in people's lives recently. It's a different conversation than a year and a half ago about what the role of government is, how it matters to people, the sense that it has their back, and maybe faltering support as well as the pandemic wears on for that view. So I think a lot is in play, and also you have to be kind of careful not to ratchet it all up too much on too many surfaces.
Yeah, thank you, Kari. Yeah, and no way, we never hold you as speaking for the government of Canada. But thank you very much on the carbon tax. Anyway, that's for sure. I think that's a great opportunity. That's, many would say, not going up nearly as fast as it has to. But Marc, maybe if you don't mind, you kind of in many ways started this conversation. What are your thoughts on where the biggest, if you will, bang for your buck is when it comes to driving up the revenues that will close some of those income security gaps that we have? Are you in agreement that maybe the lowest hanging fruit is carbon?
Well, carbon for sure. I mean, I think the areas that we want to think about for taxation. We want to reduce negative externalities in the economy, and carbon is obviously an example of that, and advertising is another one, as Andrew pointed. And I think even the excess consumption by the wealthy is a form of negative externality. We want taxation to improve the distribution of income and wealth, and we want a source of revenue to pay for public services and income transfers that support the poorest among us. And I would argue that all three of those things would increase overall well-being and the improve the distribution of well-being in society. So, I mean, we talked about land and taxation of property. We already do this. We already have an administrative apparatus to do this. We could do it more progressively. We could add other financial assets to that tax base as well. So, I mean, this is what Thomas Piketty suggested in his capital book around global wealth taxes. It would be based on, this administrative apparatus we've created for property taxation. I think one of the issues is like, do you tax wealth as an ongoing rate every year, or do you tax it only upon transfer or sale, whether it's inheritance tax or some other kind of a tax, transfer tax, we call them in British Columbia. I would generally argue for annual taxation because of the lumpiness associated with those other forms. And yeah, it strikes me that we can totally do it. And really, like, if we're having this conversation about how we tax wealth and how we do it in a more progressive manner, that's the conversation we'd be having, as opposed to having some different conversation around public expenditures or to tax or not tax.
Right. Thank you, Mark. Derek, final thoughts on this issue. Then we're going to go to the Q&A here, the chat box, because there's some amazing ideas coming in, which I want to share with you, both questions and comments. So, Derek.
Yeah, I think tax is a great way of altering behavior, like we've seen with carbon tax. One thing we haven't talked about is the corporate tax rate, which we continue to cut and cut and cut, right? I'm also thinking that we have this growing challenge of precarious employment, right? We have lots of low-wage workers, the gig economy, and so on, and that has a social cost and a fiscal cost, right, in terms of health and welfare expenditures, which it seems is, in a sense, a subsidy to those corporations that are not actually paying a living wage to their employees. So maybe we need to recoup that cost from those who fail to provide that living wage for their employees. So can we have differential corporate tax rates based on how well you treat your workforce? So if you pay a living wage, you actually pay a lower tax rate, recognizing that you're contributing to a healthier, more productive society. And if you have exploitative labor relationships, well, then you pay a higher tax rate and we recoup that cost from you, which is being borne by the rest of society. So I think that would be a way of both recouping the cost as well as incenting that behavior to try to create more quality employment, which would benefit those on the bottom.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks for bringing that in. That's a whole another kettle of fish, isn't it? That you're talking about. I mean, minimum wages kind of goes to that as well. I mean, some would say that's your simplest way forward in terms of ensuring non-exploitative relationships is transforming minimum wages into living wages. I mean, make that your minimum wage. And in many ways, you've got the kind of basement pricing of your labor to make sure they can not be forced to live in poverty, which we see so many workers having to do, especially in a gig economy. And as I say, opening up a huge can of worms. So let me get to some of the questions here now. And what I may do just kind of in a popcorn way is maybe just ask either some of our responders or some of our two researchers to maybe comment on some of these things, because there's some really interesting ones here. Maybe Kari, I'm going to give you the first one here. This is it's kind of an interesting one. On advertising, governments all over the place in Canada as well advertise their GDP trends every quarter. So the economy expanded by this or that. This advertising is a powerful psychosocial influencer shaping the beliefs of Canadians. What would it look like if governments reduced this advertising and opened up advertising space with a quality of life framework? In effect, trying to now start to advertise about our trends on happiness as opposed to on more traditional economic bases. What would be your thoughts about that?
Well, thanks. I'd love to talk about this one. Very much where my head has been for the last year. And we're pretty excited about the release of our draft quality of life framework in the last budget. And one of the core messages of that has been, we're not leaving growth behind. It's very much a part of living standards and a good quality of life in Canada, and continuing to, for example, expand our social service offerings. But we do think that the level of focus on GDP at the expense of other metrics that matter at least as much is a bit asymmetrical, and something that we can remedy through greater focus on a range of metrics that better capture the sort of fullness of human experience. And I think something that I would highlight is there's a large machine around GDP. There's a lot of people and a lot of expertise. There's a lot of forecasts. There's a lot of analysis. There's a very solid set of interchangeable statistics. And where some of the work, I think, needs to be is in catching up some of the other metrics that we care about, so that we have that depth of expertise in measurement, forecasting in some cases, analysis of the drivers, understanding of the influence of our levers in other metrics that we care about. I think something I'm proud of is that this budget 2021 doesn't just have an economic outlook chapter, it has an economic and social foundations chapter. I think that's a very subtle and yet profound marker of a shifting conversation inside the Department of Finance, and that reflects a broader global movement to take into account a broader range of factors. So, I mean, I think there's value in it. I think there's a lot of new activity for us. For example, tracking more subjective indicators that, a lot of economists have been taught to see subjective as almost a dirty word that means not reliable or robust. And so we have to sort of unpack that a little bit and say, no, it's the best measure of people's lived experience, and here's the science around it, and here's why it's useful. But we're not in the world of, moving away from some of the things we've traditionally cared about. We're in the world of complementing them with a broader sense of what else matters to human well-being, future outlook, sense of economic security, trust in institutions, family and social and community networks, social capital, social cohesion, environment. We've got conservation areas, access to green space, these sorts of things that have typically been always influenced government investments decisions on some level. But at the same time, I think we have a framework to do that more explicitly. And I'm pretty excited about it. And also, just a little plug, we'd love to hear what you think. And if you want to have a look in Annex 4 of Budget 2021, we introduced it. There's also a green paper and an address where you can send comments that's in the budget.
And I promised the audience and participants that this was not a planted question at all. This is it just worked out that way. What do you know? That's great. But Kari, it sounds to me like this is not an either or for you. This is an and, not an or. And that's interesting. And maybe the time is not to come to kind of sub out one to sub in the other, but maybe it will come in at some point. Who knows? Derek, I'm going to ask you what your thoughts are on this. Another great question. In Norway, where the person who's making the comment lived for over a decade, and where there's higher perceived well-being than in Canada, income taxes are indeed completed for all residents by the tax authorities, kind of like what Paul was saying. This level, that reverse onus taxation, this levels the playing field. Of course, there is a strong taxes are a good thing culture and high levels of trust in government. How might you propose first steps in changing the taxation culture here in Canada to be more reflective of what appears to be the reality in Norway?
I think the foundation of all of this is trust. And you mentioned that's an important element there in Norway. I wish I knew how to address the question of trust, but it's not typically where we start, and maybe that's where we need to focus our attention. We've seen, if people follow the Edelman Trust Barometer, we've seen declining global levels of trust for the last couple of decades in government, in media, in even in nonprofit organizations and so on. And I think that really challenges our ability to do what we need to do to shift that narrative, especially when we're in this mindset of scarcity. So maybe the place to start is sort of proactive extension of trust to people. And I was part of a policy initiative and around the table with local government, and the question was, why doesn't the community trust us? Why doesn't the community trust us? And I suggested that maybe we've got the question wrong. Is why don't we trust them? And maybe if we reflected on that and thought, how is it that we can start to create that high trust culture? What do we need to do? Maybe it's got to do with the proposals from Nick about curriculum around not just luck, but broader empathy, trust, and so on. If we start there, we might create the conditions that allow us to make these other changes that I think we need to make.
Thanks for that. Yeah, tough, very tough question. Sorry to put you on the spot there. Interesting, the Edelman barometer. I think I'm right on this. Someone could correct me, but I think the government worldwide with the highest level of trust is the Chinese government, and that's largely attributed to them having delivered strong opportunities for wealth development and joining the economy over the course of the last 20 years. Anyway, that's for your reflection. The next one is, this one is actually not just for Nick, it's directed at Nick. So put on your seatbelt for this one. In response to Nick, we, and this looks like someone from the research community, we tried to convince wealthy adults that luck played a role in their success, and it was a staggering failure. We briefly described these studies in the New York Times, and a link is sent here about this. You may know what I'm talking about here. So I would be curious whether there is evidence that children, especially from wealthy families, can be effectively taught this concept. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm actually ahead of you there, James, because I've been replying to Elizabeth Dunn, who's actually an expert in this area, and it's actually one of the, she should be talking here instead of me, really. And I am personally curious as well. And if you actually go and look at the reply, I actually try to get Elizabeth and her team to be interested in collaborating in this research field in the future, cross-culturally, because I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think many people know the answer to that. But I agree with Elizabeth, actually, that I even before knowing the results, I think I kind of knew in advance that it's going to be exceedingly difficult to convince the already very, very rich to change their mind. And that's why I thought about children, about the next generation. So moving towards that generation, it would be nice to know whether creating a good curriculum to help change minds about luck and effort could lead to better future, in better future for them, maybe not for us.
Thank you, Nick. I'm not sure if we're allowed to give Elizabeth the floor here. Is there any way to unmute her and get her into the conversation? Maybe that's not possible. I'm not sure if it is. In the meantime, thank you for that, Nick. Here's a question. There's actually a number of questions in this, but I think it's a really important one around the taxation issue and the flight of capital and so on. And I'm just wondering if I could ask maybe who can we give this to? Maybe Marc You'll take this one if you don't mind. International cooperation remains a challenge. Is equilibrium zero taxes? In other words, what if consumer happiness depends on Uber and Uber leaves the country if you tax them? So what about the flight of capital? Is really large tax-based initiatives, is it a prerequisite that we have reciprocity and treaty types of arrangements to ensure that it doesn't really matter where they'll go, they'll be treated the same way?
When it comes to corporate taxation, yeah, ideally we would be able to set some, minimum standards by countries cooperating. Otherwise, you get into sort of that prisoner's dilemma game. But I also think, economists would say that, we should focus on immobile tax bases. So they would say discouraging sort of capital more directly, but, we talked about land, how you can't move land out of the country to avoid the tax. If you want to advertise in Canada, you have to pay the tax. There are certain things that are required. So I think there's some sensitivities around capital mobility, but to the extent that services need to be delivered locally and in real meat space, there are always going to be ways to develop taxation to capture that. It's more a question of the political will.
Yeah, so true, so true. Okay, I want to now, we don't have tons of time left, about 10 minutes, 12 minutes by my computer. I kind of want to open it up to all of you again. I just kind of want to preface this and give you time to think about it. Researchers first, you were asked to throw out one idea. As I say, Nick cheated a little bit, threw out two. Excuse you for that because they were both pretty cool. I'm going to ask, what was next on your list? If you had to go down your list to the next policy idea, evidence-based, that would contribute mightily to the advancement of well-being, what would that have been? And I'm going to ask the same question to the responders too. So in this sense, you don't have to respond. You can put your hand up and tell us all what you think would be the very best thing we can do, perhaps beyond what we've already been talking about. So let's put on your thinking caps here and share with us, maybe in a blue sky way, what's next on the list. Andrew, could we ask you to go first?
Yes, we're certainly learning a lot about the importance of the environmental factors, but I won't put that forward just at this moment. I think I would try to focus on the members of our society who are really very unhappy. If we look across the world, we know that countries like Denmark and Finland and the Netherlands and so on tend to come very near the top of happiness rankings across nations. And there's some evidence that what they managed to do is to, you might say, cut off a large slice of the very unhappy people. That's how they get the average level of happiness. I'm speaking loosely here, high, you see. And then I would go back to this notion that really social safety nets for people who weren't as lucky as I was. My father was a doctor. I ended up doing a PhD at Oxford. I had a lot of luck, you might say. I'd focus on the social safety nets for people who weren't as lucky as some of the rest of us.
It's a really lovely thought to actually think about it in a very tactical way. Who is at the bottom, and how do you measure that, and how do you get at them? How do you engage them? Kind of Derek's point as well in what that algorithm may be. But we think about that a lot in the social services. Who are those super users of all of our services, like who use housing benefits, child protection benefits, and so on. Like, how do we concentrate on helping them get back on the wire of their life? Those are really interesting and important questions. I think reflect what you're saying too. Thank you, Andrew. Nick, over to you.
Well, I'm going to cheat again, James. I'm going to cheat by, since we can't invite Elizabeth up here, I'm going to channel her work because it's actually one of her work, and Dan Gilbert's and Timothy Wilson, and among lots of psychologists who studied how to spend money better for happiness. And that's an incredible kind of rich resource on this. And Elizabeth would be able to tell you much more than I can about, because part of the reason why people pursue status and rank, because they believe that that's what brings their happiness. But in fact, if we can spend money on experience, spend money pro-socially, and there are many other ways to do that. And I think that's the way to progress as a society, not just, as a whole. I mean, if we can spend better, that each dollar will count more for happiness, that might be another way, I think.
Thank you, Nick. Kari.
Well, so I spent a number of years in New Zealand and Australia, and we, in New Zealand in particular, is a unitary state. They have great data and great data that cuts across what are different orders of government for us. And it's difficult to sort of look at people's pathways. And looking at the sort of assembly of that data, it's really clear, as you were saying previously, the super users, or the people whose lives are coming into contact with crisis services, are coming in contact with many crisis services. And so government has a long tail in terms of a particular group of people. And in many cases, that group is people whose families didn't work for them. So the emblematic amongst them would be children leaving care. Or children in care, but also the aged children who grow out of care and now no longer have somebody who is sort of necessarily has their back. So if I was to choose a well-being policy, I think one of them might be to think hard about the state's role in supporting grown foster kids when they're no longer in care. In particular, for example, free tuition. Or what other life supports might help people. And I note that the recent BC study of income support singled out that group, and I would as well, for particular policy attention. I think there's a lot of social issues that manifest in other spaces, be it murdered and missing Indigenous women, or post-traumatic stress in the military or police forces that relates to adverse childhood experiences. And if we could better sort of understand and put together that pattern, I think we would be able to isolate some of the sort of underlying drivers of really poor life satisfaction and well-being outcomes.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kari. I'm really glad you mentioned adverse childhood experience. We know that's such a predictor of adult challenges in so many ways, physical, mental, and otherwise. So let's pull in Marc now. Marc, you can freestyle here. Where would you take us?
Okay, well, I'm gonna throw the political feasibility stuff out the window for a sec and just say, I mean, we should eradicate extreme poverty and we should eradicate extreme wealth. We should basically cut off the tails of both of those, dramatically compress the overall distribution of wealth. And by wealth also is income, because of the flows that come from assets. So I think that would be a great way of doing it. I mean, so coming back to the idea of taxing wealth, and we can put that into existing services. We can put it into developing new public goods. During COVID, public parks became such an important part of staying sane and connected. Even something like this is a bit more harebrained, but like you could potentially have a collective inheritance, that every adult, when they reach the age of 25, gets their share, instead of a private inheritance that you would get of like $1 million from your grandparents or whatever, every kid gets, some amount of money that they could put towards investing in a business or buying real estate or doing whatever they want. And I think even if you have like sort of very free market views on these kind of things, that idea may have some sort of appeal in the sense that it levels the playing field and creates more dynamism and innovation potentially in the marketplace.
I love it. I love it. That's super interesting. I think the Blair government and the Martin governments, of course, introduced a fairly modest funding for low-income children to access university. So that was income-based and tried to create the mindset that you will go to university, because the funding started as of 4 or 5 years old. I can't remember actually the name of the policy, but really, really progressive, really interesting. Thank you for that. Just just quickly, pro or con universal basic income, and in what form?
Sorry, that's a whole other lecture, because universal basic income is sort of in the eye of the beholder. So it totally depends. The BC did this great panel review on basic income, where they argue that at much lower costs, they can target the very specific areas that would have a maximum benefit in reducing poverty without necessarily having a basic income. But at the same time, basic income is kind of a sticky idea, and people seem to like it. So we could introduce that in some respects through the tax benefits and other things. We already do that for seniors and children. So it's really about working age adults and what system that looks like.
Thank you, Mark. Derek, what about you?
Well, maybe I'll bring us up to 30,000 feet view rather than specific policy proposals. What I think would be helpful would be a full implementation of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which we've started to pay more attention to. We see a lot of talk about housing as a right. The right to housing is now an international housing strategy. There was talk in the federal poverty strategy about poverty being a violation of human rights. So if we started to actually implement that idea, I think it would have a few important effects. First of all, you're grounding it in an international framework, which imposes certain conditions on us at all levels, but not just government. Sort of all stakeholders in society are sort of bound by the progressive realization of rights. But I think it also shifts the narrative. It's kind of goes back to that paradigm, because the important thing about rights is that it's universal, right? So it's not about us, them, about anybody getting special rights. It says we all have a right to these things like healthcare, which we already kind of agree on, but also employment, a standard of living, education, the right to social assistance at a reasonable level. We say that these are things that we are entitled to. So it gets us beyond that kind of individualistic paradigm that we're caught in, and also gets us beyond the scarcity paradigm, because it says we actually have enough, and we know that because we're guaranteed that in these rights. And if there's a specific policy angle to this, it might be to put social condition as a prohibited grounds of discrimination in our Charter of Rights, and that we hold dearly. So I would argue that we shift our focus to one of human rights, and use that as our guiding framework going forward.
Thank you, Derek. It's funny, yeah, it took us to get to the end of our happiness panel to talk about the very rights that would guarantee it. And today, you're absolutely right. Economic rights are not recognized by the Canadian courts. Simple as that. Now, I think I would say there's a small step in terms of the new federal housing legislation towards that, which is kind of interesting, the approach that they're taking in that regard. But I sincerely feel like we are still quite a way away from that vision, which I think perhaps most of us on this call share, that those are the kinds of measures that, in other areas of the rights conversation we take for granted, that we still don't in probably the areas that, as I say, are likely to lead us to improved well-being faster than any other. And I think that's a great way to end it, folks. I'm sincerely grateful to all of you for your creativity, to your daring to to out some of those ideas that are deep within you and that maybe you've only kept to yourself, to share with this audience, I think, some of the pathways to a better Canada, a better world. And I'm truly grateful for it. And with that, I'll pass it over to Chris Barrington-Leigh to close us up.
Thank you, Jim. I mean, I have to say I'm just elated at the richness of this discussion, which I guess flows from having such expertise and thoughtfulness in the room. So incredible thanks to all of you, Kari, Derek, Mark, Nick, Andrew, for your preparation and your time and insights, and for the rich discussion today. And a special thanks to Jim Hughes for moderating. And also thank you to everybody who asked such great questions, Liz, Yannick, Edda, and Clay. Many of these ideas were music to my ears, and it's very interesting how we have 4 policy themes in a conference, and it's very interesting to watch them intersect and to see the psychosocial education and protection of children as possibly being key to changing those myths and paradigms about our income and consumption. So for all of you, please notice that the discussion on the conference platform doesn't stop here. And if you click on Q&A, you can find questions and answers from our other sessions last week and today, as well as from this one. And so to all, thank you for attending. Be good, take care of each other. Our conference has a week off for many of you. So next Friday, we have an invited session. So invitees will be taking today's discussion and delving deeper into how change may come to pass on these issues, on these policies, and how the life satisfaction lens changes how policy could or might come to be. And you will then get to hear the synthesis of those discussions on May 28th, when we'll have our not to be missed closing synthesis discussion, as well as a not to be missed keynote closing address. So on that note, thank you very much and farewell.